This really happened to me, and though time has softened the edges, the key in my desk still reminds me it wasn't a dream. I'm telling you exactly how it unfolded, because there's no other way to make sense of what my daughter-in-law did to me in my own restaurant. My daughter-in-law turned the brass key in the pantry door, clipped it to her lanyard, and announced loud enough for the Saturday staff to hear, "Only managers need access. You're just the help now." We were gathered in the prep kitchen at my River North spot in Chicago, stainless tables lined with sheet pans, the scent of simmering marinara catching in the steam. The pastry team had clustered around the flour bins, the line cooks by the spice rack, pretending not to stare, while my son stood there, trapped between us like a patron at the host stand during a fire drill. Then Chef Mateo walked in through the swinging door, wiped his hands on his apron, and said, to me and only me, "We need your sign-off, owner. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows." I opened that restaurant 10 years ago with insurance money from my late husband, a retired firefighter whose jacket still hangs in the office on a hook above the safe. My name is Diane, I'm 62, and when I say our restaurant, I mean a neat rectangle on Clark Street, 2 blocks from the Merchandise Mart, where the windows fog in winter and open like little lungs in summer. I baked my first rolls in the tiny back oven when we couldn't afford new equipment, bought used banquettes from a shuttered trattoria in Bucktown, and memorized every regular by their favorite tables. The couple who loved the corner under the vintage Cinzano poster. The solo writer who sat at the bar by the mirror that doubles the room's warmth. When my son Ethan married Harper, I tried to open my arms as wide as my dining room, even though her smile always felt like a handshake that squeezes back harder than yours. I noticed the first change with spreadsheets. I'm old school. I keep ledger paper, ink smudges on my fingers, notes about flour counts in the margins. Harper told me that if we wanted to scale, we needed to streamline. She wore heels that clicked through the dining room like a metronome and used words like scalable about a soup recipe that came from my mother's porcelain index cards. She swooped in during brunch shifts, reskinned our Instagram with slicker filters than the restaurant ever needed, and reassigned hosts like chess pieces. Ethan followed her lead as if it were the dance he'd promised to learn when he vowed to love her forever. I chalked my unease up to age and grief. I still trace the outline of my husband's photograph sometimes before I close the office door. Then, 2 weeks before the pantry key incident, I noticed a vendor invoice with the wrong logo in the header. We'd worked with North Shore Produce since the beginning. Suddenly there was Prosperity Farms Midwest, LLC, a company I didn't recognize, with a post office box in Schaumburg. The tomatoes tasted watery, the basil browned too fast, and the mozzarella arrived in vacuum bags without the fresh brine we'd specified. When I asked our Sue to pull the purchase orders, she told me Harper had moved all ordering to a proprietary platform. I hadn't signed off on any platform, proprietary or otherwise. It was my name on the liquor license, my signature with the bank, my operating agreement in the filing cabinet, or so I thought. The night before the cast-iron skillet of humiliation, I kept the restaurant later than usual to watch the last seating finish their tiramisu. I stared at the wood grain of table 7 and thought about the first night we ever hit 100 covers. In those days, my son grinned back at me from the dish pit, sleeves rolled to the elbow, hair stuck to his forehead with steam. The kid who used to sit on a flour sack to watch me knead dough had become a man who checked apples for bruises one by one. When he brought Harper to dine before their wedding, she made a face at the scuffed floorboards and traced circles on the wine list with her fingernail. That night, she told me we should lean heavy into influencer tastings, as if loyalty were a trend and not a muscle you build with time. Saturday morning, we prepped for a private party, a bridal shower of 20 from Lakeview, and the kitchen was a swirl of garlic and chatter. I walked in early and reached for the pantry door, because the cinnamon we use for our ricotta donuts is a specific Ceylon I keep on the top shelf in a labeled jar. The door didn't budge. I jiggled the handle and thought of all the times I'd told the staff, "If you can't find it in the pantry, you haven't looked hard enough." That's when Harper clipped the key to her lanyard, that little gold tag she'd ordered with Harper Manager engraved, and spoke to me like a guest who'd walked in without a reservation. "Boundaries, Diane. We have to protect assets." It wasn't just the pantry. She'd put locks on the dry storage, changed the passcode on the POS, and created a new email list I couldn't access. She stood in the doorway with one heel pressed into the mat's ribbing, like she wanted to leave an imprint. "Chain of command," she said, and the phrase sounded like drywall dust in my mouth. Ethan hovered behind her, eyes down, as if he were checking the grout for cracks. Then the swinging door opened, and there was Mateo, sleeves dusted in flour, tattoos glinting under kitchen lights. He looked from me to Harper, then to the pantry, then to the staff who had gone silent enough for the simmering pots to speak. "We're not adding the ricotta to the donuts until Diane tastes the batch," he said, not loud, not defiant, just the simple language of how we'd done things since the beginning. "Owner has final say." The word landed like a dropped plate. Owner. It was my word, and it had been slipping out of my hands. Harper smiled without showing teeth. "She's stepping back," she said brightly. "We're optimizing." "I'll taste the batch," I said, keeping my voice steady, "and then I'll step wherever I choose." We never reached the cinnamon jar. Not that day. Not until I learned how much of my own house someone had already tried to furnish with their name. I spent that afternoon in the office behind the kitchen, the one with the thrift store painting of lemons that I could never hang straight. The filing cabinet where I kept our operating agreement, a dog-eared stack initialed by my lawyer at a desk in the Daily Center, contained a manila folder with a log sheet I had never signed. The signature block bore my name in my cursive, except not mine. The date read 3 weeks earlier, and the page was a consent of members shifting managerial authority to a new managing member, Harper. Attached was a statement of change for the Illinois Secretary of State, already stamped received. I didn't remember signing anything. I would sooner forget my own name than sign the restaurant away. My fingers shook so badly, I sat on my hands. The tears came hot and furious, and I wasn't crying about paper. I was crying because paper can be used to build a house or to block a door. I pictured my husband's hands, the calluses on his knuckles from prying open stuck windows in winter, and I thought, "Get up. There's a bank branch at Clark and Huron where the manager knows me by name." I walked there with my scarf flying behind me like a flag. The woman at the desk pulled up our business accounts and tilted the monitor slightly away when she recognized my name. There had been new user access granted that week. A business card printer had charged us for a rush order of management cards, and ACH had gone out to Prosperity Farms Midwest, LLC. I asked for the forms to freeze new payees. She told me she couldn't do it without the current manager's authorization. That night, at the Purple Pig on Michigan Avenue, I met with Mateo, because when your name is being rubbed off the sign, you go to the person who cooks your recipes like prayers. He'd never liked meetings outside the kitchen, always awkward in chairs not meant for the heat of a line cook's body, but he came because he'd watched me teach his hands to salt with my eyes. He told me how procurement had changed, how Harper had fired the pantry porter who'd been with us since opening day because head count is cost, not culture, how the new dessert wine tasted like an apology. He told me someone had been skimming inventory, calling it spoilage on the spreadsheet, while the servers fielded compliments for the new lighter sauce. Lighter because the olive oil was cheap. Lighter because a recipe is a promise, and someone had broken it in the margins. "I need proof," I said. "Not a feeling, not even yours. Proof I can carry into a room with wood-paneled walls and a judge who likes numbers more than stories." "I can log procurements," he said. "I can track waste with photos. I can record the shipments. We can set traps, change a spice label with a code, see what disappears. And the pantry key? I asked. He smiled a little. We'll get it back the right way. The next morning at 6, I parked on Wells Street, where the meters are free before 8, and I walked through the alley to the back door. The alley was all sun-bleached cardboard and cigarette butts, like most restaurant alleys in this city, except the handle of our dumpster had been tied with a fresh length of nylon rope. I had told the company years ago to keep it unlocked to make early prep easier. The knot was neat, purposeful. I untied it and lifted the lid. Inside, stacks of broken-down boxes with Prosperity Farms Midwest stamped in green, and a black contractor bag, heavier than it should have been for just peelings and coffee grounds. I slit it with a paring knife and found mozzarella bags, seals sliced carefully, fluid drained to cut weight, not spoilage, siphoning. That bag was their mistake, thrown away on a day I'd decided I was done accepting optimizing as something done to me. When I reached for the pantry door, Harper's voice carried from the dining room. She had her phone out, walking and filming, turning the empty morning space into a personal runway. Layering behind-the-scenes content, she called. Ethan says we need to humanize you, Diane. Smile. I'm busy, I said, and I was, dragging a contractor bag toward the office, leaving a wet trail that smelled like the sad end of a cheese's life. She tilted her head. What's that? Proof, I said. Harper's smile didn't falter, but the phone wavered. You should have run that by me. You're not my manager, I said quietly. And even if you were, you're not my conscience. She laughed like I'd told a joke. We'll see what the Secretary of State says. I've already seen, I said, and watched her pupils tighten a fraction. You can learn a lot about a person by how their eyes move when a key fits a lock they thought they owned. The balance of power shifts slowly in restaurants. A new dish takes a week to feel like it belongs. A new manager takes months to understand that no table is just two top in the window. It is the table where a couple decided to forgive each other and split a meatball because they were tired of cutting things in half. Harper moved quickly, which made her look decisive. Decisive can also be reckless. She hired a consultant from Los Angeles, someone who used words like brand architecture and guest journey, and set a date for a relaunch dinner with a small journalist invite list, including a freelancer from the Tribune and a blogger whose tagline was Chicago Food Hot Takes. She put Ethan in front of the camera with a script that called me our founding matriarch, a phrase that made me feel embalmed. The staff were divided. Servers who loved tableside stories looked at their shoes during pre-shift when Harper rattled off metrics. Newer hires, dazzled by the promise of collabs, liked the sound of tiered influencer seating. Mateo kept his head down and cooked, but the day he found the spice mix I used for meatballs cut with breadcrumbs from a cheap supplier, he put his tongs down and asked me, in a voice meant for two people only, "How much longer?" "As long as it takes," I said, trying to sound like a woman who had more time than anger. I went downtown to the Richard J. Daley Center, where the escalators hum like a hive and the marble makes everyone's shoes sound expensive. I met with an attorney named Selma in a suit, the color of coffee. She read the consent of members with a pencil resting against her lip. "This is a forgery," she said, like a doctor looking at a scan and pointing to a shadow that explained the pain. "And even if it weren't, your operating agreement requires unanimous consent for a change like this. There's no unanimous consent when your signature is a Xerox copy of a dream someone had about your handwriting." I asked what we could do. She said, temporary restraining order and forensic accountant and injunctive relief. And suddenly the words I'd flinched from became instruments, not threats. She told me we needed more than doctored cheese bags. We needed money flows. We needed a pattern. Mateo set to work invisibly, because invisible work is the knife you only notice after it has already cut the rope. He photographed shipments as they arrived, logged cases and weights, stored 2 jars of the Ceylon cinnamon side by side with tiny pencil dots on the labels to mark the difference. He counted the ounces of olive oil across nights and noted where the waste log did not match the plate counts. He befriended a new line cook, one of Harper's hires, who wore his cap backward and joked that he'd done time at a place in Wicker Park where the owner didn't know the difference between saffron and turmeric, which is not the same as saying you didn't take a cut from a vendor. I drove to Schaumburg on a Wednesday and found the P.O. box for Prosperity Farms Midwest, which sat inside a strip mall post center between a nail salon and a vape shop. The woman behind the counter told me she couldn't discuss clients, but when I asked for tape, she left the sign-in book open. There were 3 entries that week, all in the same hand with oversized swoops on the R's, a hand that looked like it had learned to write while carrying a shopping bag. I took a picture with my phone. When the forensic accountant, a calm man named Arjun, sat in my office 2 days later, he drew circles on a legal pad like a teacher. "Kickback scheme," he said. "Procurement is the faucet. Money is leaving the sink in a straight line." He tapped the circles. "We'll prove it with matched invoices, vendor filings, and the change in COGS coinciding with the so-called optimization." He said the last word gently, so I wouldn't flinch. The Friday before the relaunch dinner, Harper gathered the staff and announced a new era. She wore a white blazer that dared the marinara to touch it. Ethan stood at her shoulder, palms together like a prayer he intended to keep. She handed out glossy laminated guest journey maps that instructed servers to mention the new mozzarella as artisan, the new olive oil as Tuscan emerald, a phrase that made me want to scream into a dish towel. That night, a reservation appeared in the system under KLA Food. Harper practically floated. She asked me to sit this one out. "Just enjoy as a guest." I said I wouldn't be attending. I had plans with a clerk who stamped things that mattered. The clerk stamped our motion for a temporary restraining order with a thunk that felt like a key turning. The judge signed a short order requiring that no changes in management or procurement shall be made pending a hearing. A sheriff's deputy would serve it. Tomorrow night during service, I asked Selma. She looked at me, measured, and said, "If you want the message heard at full volume." I slept for 3 hours that night, dreamed of my husband as he was when he was 25, and we'd buy Italian sausage at J.P. Graziano on Randolph and eat it standing up in the kitchen, and woke with the taste of fennel and regret. I arrived at the restaurant before anyone else and ran my hands along the pantry door. The same brass, the same weight, history walled up behind a lock that didn't belong to me anymore. Harper showed up in heels that looked like weapons. She announced, "Tonight we go viral." Mateo started stock like a man who trusts heat more than hope. The first guests arrived. Music pulsed low through the speakers, the playlist Harper's consultant had called approachable modern, which is a phrase I never want to hear again. At 6:40, the blogger posted a story to Instagram from Table 3 with the caption, "Old School Chicago Spot Goes New School." At 7:10, the Tribune freelancer ordered the new mozzarella appetizer and wrote something in a notebook that made Harper touch her hair. At 7:30, the deputy walked in. He stood by the host stand, took off his hat like a gentleman, and asked for the manager. Harper glided over, her smile glossy. The deputy handed her the order. She read the first lines and laughed, the kind of laugh that comes out sharp when a glass chips and you pretend you meant to bite. "Diane," she called over her shoulder, "your little placeholder won't stop progress." The deputy cleared his throat. "Ma'am, it isn't a placeholder. It's enforceable. Immediately." He looked at me. "You're Diane?" I nodded. "Then until a hearing, you're the one making calls." The dining room went quiet enough for the ice in glasses to whisper. Harper tried to wave the order like a napkin. She turned to Ethan. "Say something," she hissed. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Let's talk in the office," he said to me, the way a son talks to the mother he still hopes to please and the wife he's afraid to disappoint. "In the pantry," I corrected. "We'll talk in the pantry." The key on Harper's lanyard had a tiny gold charm that said H. The deputy could have demanded it, I didn't want force. I wanted clarity. I held out my hand. Please. She rolled her eyes and made a show of unclipping it, like she was handing a toddler a toy. The staff watched the way people watch storms from windows. The deputy stepped a fraction closer, enough to say without words, "Don't make me repeat the law to you." When the key touched my palm, I felt the weight of 10 years click into place. I unlocked the door. The pantry smelled like cumin and thyme. I walked inside, reached for the top shelf, and lifted down the cinnamon jar I had labeled in my own careful block letters. Matteo hovered in the doorway, the deputy behind him, the dining room leaning in. "Owner," he said again, simple as a breath, and I wanted to cry because sometimes the truest words feel like water after months of dust. Then I set the cinnamon jar on the table and unscrewed the lid to show the dot Matteo had penciled under the label. The jar seal had been broken and replaced. Cheap cinnamon had been poured into the expensive jar. "We have receipts," I said, loud enough for anyone who cared to hear, "and this is the smallest of them." Harper crossed her arms. "You're going to make a spectacle?" "Only of the truth," I said. 2 days later, at the Daily Center, we sat in a courtroom where the wood paneling makes everyone's sins look smaller because the building has seen so many. Selma spoke first, lined everything up like a mise en place of facts. The forged consent, the undocumented vendor shift, the sudden spike in cost of goods that coincided with new invoices to Prosperity Farms, the bank card orders, the shipment photos, the altered spice jars, the staff schedule showing the pantry porter's abrupt termination after he raised questions about deliveries. Arjun testified about patterns. He used words like delta and variance and kickback with a math teacher's calm. He showed how $1 left the account and didn't return to a plate. Harper's attorney argued innovation and necessary autonomy and Diane's admirable legacy, words like a scented candle in a smoky room. They said the signature was a miscommunication. They said the vendor was interim. They said the deputy choosing to serve during dinner was theatrics. I sat there with my hands clenched and thought about all the women who have been called theatrical when they were simply refusing to be quiet at the exact moment it mattered. The judge, an older man with the calm of someone who's heard every lie 1,000 times, asked a few questions about the operating agreement. He looked at me over his glasses. "Ms. Ferraro, did you consent to a change of management?" "No, Your Honor." "Did you intend to cede authority to your daughter-in-law?" "No." "Did you approve the shift in vendor?" "No, and it's my food. It's my mother's food." He nodded. "Temporary injunction is granted. Management remains with Ms. Ferraro pending trial. All procurement changes reversed. Any funds paid to Prosperity Farms Midwest to be held pending accounting." Harper gasped like she'd been slapped with a wet towel. Her attorney squeezed her elbow. Ethan stared at his knees. I let a breath out. I didn't know I had been holding for a month and a half. Trial took 6 weeks to schedule. In that time, we rolled everything back that could be rolled without snapping. We brought back the pantry porter. We dumped olive oil that shouldn't have been there and called in our old rep from North Shore Produce, who hugged me too long at the back door because he had watched my husband carry a broken fryer down the stairs in pieces. We called vendors and apologized. We remade the tiramisu so the mascarpone tasted like silk again, rather than chalky compromise. We issued a statement on Instagram that said nothing but felt like a scream. Our recipes are our promises, and we intend to keep them. People understood. Ethan came to me in the office one afternoon, eyes red. "I thought she knew things I didn't," he said. "I thought I was saving you work." "I don't need saving," I said. "I need a partner. Those are different jobs." He nodded. "I'm sorry, Mom." "Then be brave," I said. "Brave enough not to be in the room when she wants you there to shield her from herself." On the morning of trial, the sky over the river was the color of a peeled mushroom. We filed into a room where everything is measured in minutes and exhibits. Selma called Matteo, who walked the court through the pantry photographs, the spice dot, the trash bag with sliced mozzarella seals, The inventory logs that didn't match the menu counts, the employee schedule changes that removed anyone who asked questions from procurement days. Arjun built the money map. He showed Prosperity's filings with the state, filed by a registered agent who had been, until 3 months prior, an assistant at an influencer agency where Harper had done a summer. He showed payments that landed in a second LLC, where the manager of record was a cousin of Harper's who lived in Riverside, California. He pointed out that Prosperity was buying bulk from our original vendor and reselling to us with a markup and a consulting fee. "Who authorized these changes?" Selma asked. Harper claimed she had manager authority, Arjun said, and the judge looked at the forged consent again like he was turning a burned piece of toast over in his hand. Harper took the stand and tried to make the courtroom a boardroom. She used words like brand coherence and guest segmentation. She cried in the right places. She said I had checked out, that she was protecting the asset, and that older operators sometimes need help evolving. She said Ethan had asked her to take a stronger hand. She said the signature was a misunderstanding. She said the vendor shift was temporary. She said the kickback was a stipend for management labor. Selma showed her the cinnamon jar photo, and the prosecutor, because yes, by then there was a whisper from the state's attorney's office about fraud and a separate file with a number on it, leaned forward enough to make the air different. "Who altered this label?" Harper tossed her hair. "A line cook must have." "Which one?" Selma asked softly. Harper blinked. "I don't know their names." There it was, the admission of alienation. You cannot claim to love a house you don't know by the names of the people who sweep it. The judge didn't react outwardly, but I saw something close like a door behind his eyes. When he ruled, he did it in a tone like he was reading a recipe, clear, precise, inevitable. "Permanent injunction granted. Ms. Ferraro retains management and ownership. The court finds credible evidence of unauthorized changes in procurement, forgery, and self-dealing. Damages to be determined at a separate hearing. The matter of potential criminal referral is left to the state's attorney." Harper made a sound like a cork pulled wrong. Ethan didn't look at her. He looked at me, and what I saw there was not relief. It was a beginning of a new grief, the kind that comes when you realize love isn't a shield against choices. Outside on Washington Street, the wind whipped paper cups down the sidewalk, and a bus hissed at the curb. Mateo hugged me so hard my back popped. "Owner," he said, and laughed because sometimes the only way to say thank you is to repeat the word that had almost been taken from you and put it back where it belongs. The damages hearing came 3 weeks later. We presented the delta in cost of goods, the uptick in refunds after the mozzarella switch, the lost revenue from 2 private events that canceled after service went sideways under the new era, and the legal fees I'd had to pay just to keep what was mine. The judge awarded us restitution from Prosperity Farms Midwest and from Harper personally, jointly, and severally. The state's attorney filed charges for forgery and fraud, and a plea deal took shape like a shadow under a door. Harper moved out of the condo she shared with Ethan in River North and into a new apartment in West Town with 2 roommates who said content for a living. She called me once, late, a voicemail where she cried, said she never meant to hurt me, that she was trying to help, that I'd made her feel like an outsider from the start. I listened 3 times. I didn't erase it. Leaving armories full of feelings intact is part of how you forgive yourself for the things you can't fix in someone else. People say revenge is a dish best served cold, but the truth is it's best served legal and precise, plated with receipts instead of rage. The night after the damages hearing, the staff surprised me with a framed shadow box, the pantry key, matted over a photo of my husband in his jacket, laughing at something I couldn't hear but knew by heart. We hung it in the office above the safe. I asked Mateo for a tasting of the ricotta donuts. He brought them to the bar where the mirror doubles the light and stood with his hands behind his back, as if he were waiting for a grade. I bit into one. The cinnamon bloomed like memory. "This is it," I said. "This is us." He nodded and wiped at his eye like it was a speck of flour. Ethan took a leave from the restaurant. He started therapy. He asked me if time could be a bridge. I told him bridges take time to build and seconds to burn. He said he was willing to wait for the cement to cure. We didn't hug like a TV show. We sat on the back step behind the kitchen and watched a delivery truck back into the alley without hitting anything, which in our world is a kind of miracle. I went back to the pantry. I ran my hand along the spices the way some people run hands along book spines, reading the story without opening a page. The door was unlocked. It would stay that way during prep, and at night we'd lock it for all the reasons you lock something you love, not to keep people out, but to honor what is inside. The blogger from Table 3 posted a follow-up. Old school Chicago spot, back to what made it great. The Tribune freelancer filed a small piece that used the word integrity. On a Tuesday, a woman in a red coat came to the bar and said, "I brought my mother here 5 years ago before she got sick. She said these meatballs tasted like forgiveness. I brought her a plate on the house. I told her the recipe came from my mother and that sometimes the best thing we can do with what we inherit is to decide not to let anyone cheapen it." I saw Harper once more, months later, in a line at Foxtrot Market on Wells. She had her phone out, scrolling through a feed of people who were eating other people's food. Our eyes met. She opened her mouth the way a person opens a door in a house where they no longer live, cautiously, as if afraid an alarm will sound. "Diane," she said. "Harper," I said. "I'm taking a plea," she said. "Community service and restitution. No prison?" I nodded. "Mercy is a recipe, too. It requires balance, enough salt to bring out the truth, not so much you can't swallow it." "I'm sorry," she said. "For what?" I asked, genuinely. There are many acceptable answers, and I wasn't going to feed her one. "For thinking I could own what wasn't mine," she said finally. "For thinking a lock could make me safe." "You can't lock your way out of yourself," I said. She laughed then, a small, unpretty sound. "You always talk like that?" "Only when the pantry is involved." She smiled for real this time. No teeth, no weapon. "Take care, Diane." "You too," I said, and meant it. Back at the restaurant, the dinner rush sounded like a train you're happy to miss because you're already home. The server at table 1 misted the basil with a spray bottle like it was a plant we were coaxing to live. The couple under the Cinzano poster held hands while deciding whether to share dessert. A little boy at the bar watched Matteo flame a pan for a deglaze and clapped when the fire whooshed up like a magic trick. I pulled a bar stool and wrote the day's notes in the same ledger paper I've always used, ink smudging a little where I rested my palm. The pantry door stood open, the brass key resting on the hook above the safe, behind glass, where I can see it when I need to remember something simple. Locks are only as honest as the hands that hold them. The end.